Alrighty, at today's episode of Faith in Focus, I want to talk about a study that was released in a story on the Christian Post about chronic phone usage and how it affects our relationships. And of course, we're increasingly more and more getting into phone usage and being addicted to our phones. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about how, from a Christian perspective, this shouldn't be all that shocking. And so that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. Alrighty, well, as you can see, if you are watching, hopefully you can see anyways, I've gotten the video problem sorted out. I think that I'm just having to use different software, and I think it'll work out fine. I have to do a little bit more editing, but I think it's going to work, and we'll just go with it for now. But again, as I said at the outset of the episode last time, if you are watching on YouTube, subscribe, like, do all those kinds of things. It really does help the show out. There's something about the algorithms. I don't know how it works. You don't know how it works. But likes, shares, subscriptions, those kinds of things, it kind of boosts the show up the rankings, and it kind of puts it in front of more people's eyes, which helps. This is a part of my ministry with InFaith. So the more eyes on it, the more visibility, the more I'm able to do, because that just, hopefully, Lord willing, increases the amount of support that can come in, or people who just believe in the show and like, listening to my lovely voice, which I've been told I have a face that's made for radio. So hopefully you're just listening to my voice and not watching the video. Although if you're watching the video, I appreciate that too. Although my girlfriend's probably going to take exception to all of this stuff, and she's probably going to be typing insanely in the comments, which is great. Type in the comments, because then that also boosts the algorithm. But all that to say, if you are listening on Spotify, Apple, wherever you might be listening or watching, subscribe, like, share, comment, review. All of those things really do help out. And if you have been listening to Faith in Focus for a while and you think, I kind of like this guy, I like his takes, I like the way his brain thinks, I would like to see more of this content and better quality of this content. So I'm not lagging, I'm not skipping, the editing's not all terrible. All of that comes with time. And so if I could have more support and dedicate more time to something like this, that obviously means I don't have to spend time delivering coffee or substitute teaching or whatever various gig job I'm working at the time. So if you want to support, if you believe in this ministry or other aspects of my ministry, counseling, Bible teaching, single men ministry, any of those kinds of things, if you believe in those things and you want to support this ministry, you can go to infaith.org. There's something scrolling across the bottom of the screen as well. You can go to infaith.org and search my name, Dennis Sotheby. You can donate that way. You can text the word discipleship to 41444. It will then send a link to you that you can give through. So either way, any of those options, incredibly helpful. And I can't say it enough, incredibly grateful for donors. Incredibly grateful for people who watch, listen, share, comment, and all those kinds of things. It really does help out. So all that to say, this article I saw on the Christian Post, and I will share it in the show notes and try to put up screenshots on the screen so you can read along with me if you're watching. But it is titled "Chronic Smartphone Scrolling Linked to Less Sex, Marital Dysfunction, Even Among Churchgoers." Study. Now, from the outset, and I want to talk a little bit about what the article says, and I'll read some of it, but even from the title of the article, I think that is a bigger issue that is something that I want to touch on. Is there's this study that, and again, it doesn't go into the details of how they did this study, so who knows how accurate it is, but if you're like me, you know the effects of smartphone. You have all of the anecdotal evidence in your own life, in your friends' lives. We know that we're too addicted to our smartphones. So, the fact, though, that the article says this addiction to smartphones are causing all of these problems, even among churchgoers, I think that betrays a thought process that I don't think this is explicitly taught in Christianity in most churches, but I think that I think it's implicitly taught, and I think that it's believed that just by church going is obviously different than being an actual born again Christian, but let's say even Christians, you're born again, you know Jesus, however you want to define that, you know God, you're saved, okay, and you go to church, you're plugged into the church. I think that we think that automatically, puts a circle around you and a barrier around you that just makes you exempt from falling prey to problems in the world. And why wouldn't phone addiction and being addicted to our smartphones and texts, why wouldn't that have an impact along to Christians along with people in the world, people who don't know God? And I think that that just reveals that, like, just being a Christian, just being a churchgoer should somehow insulate you from these kinds of problems. And of course, that's not the case. This is why discipleship, and if you listen to this podcast, or hopefully you go to a church, you don't have to listen to this podcast to be harped on about this, or hopefully you're just reading the Bible. But this is why discipleship is so important. It's in discipleship where people learn, I will just be swept along with the world system. I will just be, as Paul says, conformed to the image of this world and to the form that this world wants to form me into, unless I am actively being transformed by the renewing of my mind, unless I am growing in Christ and growing in my knowledge of Christ and growing in my love for Christ and my relationship with Christ, I'm going to be conformed to Him. Why should we be shocked? It's the same thing when people say, well, the divorce rates in the world, it's exactly the same in the church. Now, I'm not saying those things should be this way, but just being a part of the church doesn't automatically insulate a person from the problems of the world. If you're not actively living contrary to the world system, of course you're going to be swept along with the world system. And this is the underlying problem that I think that the church fails sometimes to distinguish. We will stress the idea of being holy, which means different and distinct. We'll preach those things, and we'll often mean, like, you shouldn't listen to that kind of music. Now, that might be true, but the reasons we might give is it has too many bad words in it. Okay, now there is a case to be made that language is important. Or we'll say you shouldn't watch that movie because it's too violent. Or you shouldn't dress that way because that's what, a certain kind of people dress that way. You shouldn't wear those kinds of clothes. You shouldn't watch the. We preach being different from the world, but oftentimes in areas that are relatively superficial. Whereas in areas like how we utilize technology like this, we just get swept right along with the world. So then we face the same problems that the world face, and we think, well, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because if you live exactly like the world, you're going to be basically indistinguishable from the world. So this article starts out, it says, excessive smartphone use by a spouse has been linked to less sex and marital dissatisfaction, including among couples who attend church regularly, a new Institute for Family Studies report suggests. And researchers urge action to break the smartphone addiction among adults to fend off its potential threat to relationships. And this quote from the people who did the study said, it is difficult to determine for certain whether excessive phone use is the culprit of marital problems, given that addiction to phones may be an indicator of an already unhappy marriage. So it's a chicken or the egg thing. Are people retreating to their smartphones because they're not happy with their spouse? Or are they not happy with their spouse because they're spending too much time on Instagram? I mean, it could be a combination of both. It's kind of like a negative feedback loop. You're unhappy with your spouse, and I want to talk a little bit about maybe our psychology behind tech and phone usage. That if we take it out of the realm of online space and on our phones, it makes a lot of sense. And maybe I'll just get into that now. I've told people, and this is a policy I try to practice, and of course I'm as guilty as anyone else. It's hard to unplug from the phone, but if you are and it's one of the reasons why I don't wear my Apple Watch all too often, because it's too easily distractible. But if you're at a dinner table, if you're out getting coffee with a friend, and you're talking with them, and you're constantly texting on your phone or scrolling on your phone, that is offensive in the same kind of way that if you can just imagine, and I tell people that if you treat this smartphone or whatever tech it might be, smartphone, smartwatch, as another person. Now, of course, there's millions of people included in this thing, but if you treat it like another person, you just imagine how rude or insensitive that is if you're talking to me and I'm over here listening to this person's conversation, what they're saying over there. Oh, they're kind of talking about the Tigers game from last night. I kind of am interested in what they're saying. And you're talking to me, and I'm constantly looking over here, and okay, every once in a while, oh yeah, I agree with you. And then I look back over here, and then even maybe I'll say, hey, what was the score of that game? And I'm talking. That would be incredibly rude. But for some reason, we think that this operates differently. We think the phone operates differently. So if you can get in the habit of viewing this like you would another person. So if you're in a group of friends and you're all kind of talking, different conversations are going on, it's not necessarily offensive to bust out your phone. Now, if you're on it the whole time, that's a little offensive. But to bust it out and send a text, it would be no different than if you're in a group and somebody says, oh, hey, Dennis, don't mean to interrupt, but what's going on? Oh, okay. And then you go back to your conversation. There's certain etiquette. But if you view this as just another person or another thing that vies for your attention, and then you think the person sitting across from me talking, I want to give them my attention, not my phone, it helps really kind of draw those boundaries. So then if you can take what this article is saying in the same vein, of course it's like, well, which one is causing which? Is the dissatisfaction in the marriage causing more cell phone use, or is the cell phone use causing dissatisfaction with your spouse? Well, think about it as if it's another person. If you are not happy in your relationship with your spouse, well, you're going to start going outside of the marriage. And I'm not necessarily talking about adultery, but you're going to say, I'm going to spend a few more hours at work because I don't really want to go home and see my wife. Or, I'm going to go out to the bar or to the coffee shop with my friends a couple more days a week than I normally would have because I don't really want to go home. Or, and it could lead into extramarital affairs and relationships. Those things can happen in real life. Well, that you could be doing that with your phone. You're having those relationships through the phone. You're scrolling through other people's Instagram and social media, and if you view it as a person, it's taking away those deposits of affection that you could be directing towards your spouse, but you're annoyed with your spouse. They're getting on your nerves, so you're redirecting it towards the phone, which then your spouse starts to realize he cares more about X, Y, and Z on his phone. Or, again, take the phone out of it, but it could be he cares more about his work, so he's spending more time at work. He cares more about his friends, so he's spending more time with his friends than he does about me. Well, excuse me, that is going to then cause tension. So it's kind of, like I said, a negative feedback loop. But if you can treat this just like you would another person in the relationship, it kind of makes sense of a lot of this stuff. And it goes on to say, unhappy spouses might resort to using phones to escape or avoid communication with their partner. On the other hand, smartphones are also engineered to be addictive. And the authors of this study also say, the most likely scenario is that marital difficulty and addiction to smartphones are reinforcing each other, and that marital problems will be exacerbated to the breaking point and near impossible to address unless smartphone addiction is addressed. And again, it isn't just that it's the smartphone, it's that your affections are going towards something else other than the spouse, the person in your home, the person that you should have this intimate relationship with. It says the problem is even worse amongst younger couples and lower income families. Well, there's just more stresses on those things. There are people who are more addicted to their phones. It says husbands and wives are just as likely to feel left out because of their spouse's overuse of a smartphone. Liberals and conservatives are equally affected, as are those who attend church regularly and those who do not. So this isn't necessarily a man, woman, politically right, politically left, church or not church. It's just a human thing. There's something going on just in the human psychology of the stuff that's going on. And it talks about this partner phubbing, which I did not know was a word. It's just, I guess it means just to ignore or to distance yourself from your partner. It can best be understood as the extent to which an individual uses or is distracted by his or her cell phone while in the company of his or her relationship partner. So these are just relational problems. That's what these are. It's not necessarily the smartphone. It would be something else if it wasn't the smartphone. It says one's attachment style was found to moderate the phubbing cell phone conflict relationship. Those with anxious attachment styles reported higher level of cell phone conflict than those with less anxious attachment styles. Importantly, phubbing, again, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, was found to indirectly impact depression through relationship satisfaction and ultimately life satisfaction. So, again, my point in this is you shouldn't be shocked that, well, why does this affect church-going people as much as it affects non-church-going people? There's no mystery to it. This is just a people thing. And so I think that the church, I don't want to be critical of the church. The church is usually behind the times on a lot of things. We don't really understand the ramifications of cultural things until it's too late, and then we're responding to them. So I do think that the church should be a little bit proactive in not preaching against cell phones, because, that's just, Amish, we're just going to retreat away from technology kind of mentality. But I do think that the church should be responsible in discipling people in how to maturely use technology as a tool rather than letting it control you. And I think that if we can teach people about what healthy relationships look like, in the same way that it's indicative of an unhealthy relationship if you're pulling away from your wife or your husband to spend more time with somebody else, it's just as healthy if you're distracted when you're around them because you're on your phone. Maybe even more so with the phone, because, again, as the study talks about the addictive nature of the phone, you're living vicariously now as you're looking at other people's social media. So you're looking at somebody on Instagram whose marriage is crumbling, possibly, is crumbling just as badly as yours is, but they're lying to you and you think it looks great. And so then you're looking at your actual relationship and comparing it to a fake relationship, which is in reality is just as bad as yours, but you're becoming jealous and you're becoming resentful of, if my spouse was just only like this. So it's actually, that toxic element of technology and social media comes into play in this. If we can go to passages in the Bible to really, again, shape our view of technology, like this one in 3 John. Verse 1, or chapter 1, but there's only one chapter. So, verse 13, he says in his conclusion, I had much to write to you. He's writing to a house church. He says, I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Now, of course, pen and ink is a little bit more removed from texting. It's a little bit more immediate to text. It's even further removed. We can sort of, you can call it face-to-face, but over FaceTime and all that kind of stuff. So pen and ink is a little bit more removed and not as personal as those kinds of things. But I do think that if we can understand what he's saying, that information can be relayed through pen and paper, through not having a face-to-face interaction. Emotions and in our heart, in that relationship, it can be communicated through pen and paper, but it's better to be face-to-face. So if we can teach people within the church to really put the stuff that's in our phone here in its proper place. Hey, that stuff that you're seeing on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and stuff, those things might be fun and they might be fine and they might be healthy in a certain context, but they're not as important. I don't want to say they're not real, because those are real people. It's just like if you were, it is no different. Like, you can't say that this is not real, what's happening in your phone, so I can just say whatever I want to people. No more than you can say, well, I just wrote a pen and paper and dropped it off to them and told them, to die and, go to wherever. and that wouldn't be acceptable. So it's not to say that they're not real, but it is less important. There's a distance where, we'll often say you'll say things on your keyboard that you would never say to somebody face-to-face, because when you're face-to-face, you have to really interact with that person. So if we can stress within the church that what's happening with people, that's where the real Christian life happens. That's where real koinonia, that's where real fellowship, That's where real discipleship and church body life, that's where it happens. It's not that it can't happen like, what I'm doing now. It's not that ministry can't happen that way any more than you would say ministry can't happen through a letter like what John's writing. It can, but it's not the same. What happens is, people, this is what they'll call like incarnational discipleship or incarnational church life. It's that incarnation means the flesh, putting the flesh, the meat, onto your body. Like, you have to be able to touch people in order to really fellowship with them in a meaningful way. And then if we can really communicate to people, to Christians, that what is real, what you can touch, is so much more important than what you're seeing on your phone, then that also helps curb what's coming down the pike of virtual reality, augmented reality, wearable technology on your face, where you're living in kind of a simulated world. We won't have to be fighting to get people to unplug from that kind of stuff. We'll hopefully have been discipled to understand that, listen, when I put those goggles on, I might be able to play a fun game, but I have to take those off and then spend time with people in the real world. I have to actually be able to touch and interact with my kids, with my wife, with my friends. I have to actually be able to take communion with them from the same bread and the same cup. We have to be in person. So it's almost like the church has to refocus its teaching rather than just saying cell phone's bad because there's too much inappropriate stuff on there. I mean, there is, but that's a surface level problem with it. The problem is it's breaking down our relationships. So if I can read from another text, I think this comes from the 7 Laws of a Healthy Marriage. I can't remember the exact title of it. I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes. But it's John Gottman. He's not a Christian, but his Gottman Institute has studied marriages, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of marriages. I mean, they've got a lot of the stuff down to a science. This was one of my books I read in college. I thought it was really good. And this is true of in-person stuff. He talks about things that break down marriages and break down relationships. Most marriages don't fall apart because of one catastrophic thing. It's like death by 1,000 cuts. And what happens is he has this concept called the emotional bank account, or the love bank. And you can make deposits and you can make withdrawals from that. So every little interaction that you have with your spouse or with a person, and this would apply to friendships as well. Friendships don't just end; they kind of wither through. If you're not feeding it, it will just wither. Well, with rare exceptions, but it's the same thing. You have to be putting deposits, and they don't have to be huge ones, but you have to be putting relational deposits into that relationship in order for it to thrive. And you can draw on that relationship. You can have negative encounters, but you do that enough times, you're eventually going to end up in the red. That bank account is going to be in the negative. It's not going to be healthy anymore. So to tie it back into the phone thing, when your spouse is sitting there on the couch, and you could move near them and put your arm around them, ask them how their day is going, give them a kiss, whatever it might be. Those are tiny deposits that you could be making into that emotional bank account. But if you're instead over here on your phone, liking a tweet there, commenting here, those are all things that you're taking away from that relationship, in the same way that if there was somebody sitting on the couch on the other side and your spouse was wanting you to move towards them, you're turned away and focused and talking to this other person, which is fine in its proper context. But if you're doing that all the time, then your spouse is going to feel neglected. This is from Gottman's website. He says, an emotional bank account works the same as a financial bank account, except you can't see it, and it can be harder to track. When you build up enough positive interactions with your partner, your emotional bank account is flourishing. You feel relaxed and safe in the relationship. If you have a withdraw, i.e. you have a fight or a bid fails, it doesn't feel too bad. You have enough in there that you won't end up in the red. So you have a fight with your spouse. Well, if that emotional bank account's full, you don't want to fight, but you realize, we have enough of love for each other. This isn't going to kill the relationship. We'll get over this. We'll come back together. We'll figure it out. He says, however, when you start to get too low, i.e. the positive interactions do not outweigh the negative, some anxiety in the relationship may set in. If the negative overtakes your relationship, this is when you begin to feel that your relationship is in trouble. You become extremely concerned and perhaps even frantic as to how you will build the relationship back up, just as we would feel frantic if our bank account dipped below zero. And he says the magic ratio, and he's very scientific in his book. I think it's the 7 Principles of Marriage. Very scientific. I mean, they'll bring married couples into a house to live, and they'll study them. They'll have heart monitors hooked up to them. I mean, they're studying them on camera, incredibly close. And he says, where things get a little different with the emotional versus financial bank account is that one positive interaction in the relationship does not allow for one negative to stay balanced as it does monetarily. If you deposit $30 into your bank account, you can withdraw and spend $30. It's not the same. In this emotional bank account, what he's discovered is it's asymmetrical. The positive accounts don't equal the same amount as negative withdrawals. He says, or the writer of this article on his website says, Dr. John Gottman's research shows that couples need 5 positive interactions for every negative interaction just to break even. And again, these don't have to be big ones. A text to your spouse saying, hey, love you, I really appreciate you, whatever. That's a positive encounter. But just to keep your relationship at 0, or at the level that it's at, 5 to 1. You've got to send 5 of those texts. You've got to give 5 kisses, 5 I love you, or a combination of both, or a pat on the back, a hug, a small gift, whatever it might be. You got to do 5 of those to every one negative interaction. So when we realize that with the phone, again, tying it back into our phone addiction, every time we're sitting at a table with our spouse and we're spending time talking to this thing rather than interacting with them, that's a negative interaction. And every time we're liking and responding to stuff on this rather than interacting with them, those are negative interactions. And again, it's asymmetrical. So we're treading water because we have so much distraction with the phone. That's just to break even. It says you need 20 positive interactions to outweigh one negative. It's called the magic ratio. Therefore, to keep your emotional bank account flourishing, you need to make many more deposits than you do withdrawals. So this phone thing, that's just more of a distraction. This is more opportunities for negative interactions. Every time you ignore somebody to focus on this, you're making negative withdrawals from your emotional bank account with that person. It can also, though, be used to add positive ones. Sending a text message to someone, hey, I'm thinking about you, I care about you, those can be positive ones, but it's when it starts to overtake our actual life, our real life, when we're sitting with somebody and we're distracted by this thing, those are just adding negative interactions to the account, not positive ones. And that, I think, is at the heart of what's going on. Why are relationships and marriages struggling? Well, it's because we have so many things that can distract us that then are negative interactions in those banks, of those emotional banks with those people. And so we shouldn't be surprised as Christians. This is the world now. There's no going back. I mean, short of like a solar flare that's going to knock us back to the Stone Age. There's no going back from these things. I mean, we can definitely preach against dialing back, but I think that we have to show people why. Why is it? And that's a lot of the times when we think of rules or morals or mores or, just virtuous things, we're trying to talk in languages that's like, you should or shouldn't do these things. And we as adults are just oversized children sometimes, so we want to know why. Well, it's just bad. Just spending too much time on the phone, it is bad. Well, it's like, okay, well, it is, but why is it bad? Well, it's bad because they're distractions. They're tearing down your relationships. And how is it tearing down your relationship? Well, it's tearing them down by sucking at that emotional bank, as Gottman talks about. It's just not healthy, and it's distracting you from having positive interactions with the people in your life. So we shouldn't be surprised that Christians fall prey to this as well. Christians fall prey to following the world system in every area of life. If you are not renewing your mind and thinking about what does the Bible say about X, Y, and Z, and how am I going to change my life to live in accordance with what the Bible says, you're just going to be conformed to the image of this world. It's not rocket science. It should not be surprising that if you follow the pattern of the world, you're going to get the same output. This is where, when the Bible says a man reaps what he sows, if you sow to the flesh, you're going to reap corruption. If you live with your cell phone the exact same way that worldly people live with their cell phone, you're going to have the same problem. You're going to have unhealthy relationships in the real world, which is where the body of Christ meets together in person. This is where fellowship happens. This is where body life and ministry really happens, is in person. And if in person, we're sucking more from our emotional bank accounts than we're putting in because of our phone, it's going to, of course, hinder relationships. So that being said, I'm glad you were distracted for the past half an hour listening to this, probably on your smartphone. But turn it off. Text somebody that you care about. I love you. Go back to spend time with your spouse, your friends. Do something in real life, in the body of Christ, and with the people in your life. And so that's what I have for you today. Hopefully it's encouraging that there is hope beyond this crazy little 6-inch tech box of technology that we are so tethered to and focused on. So that's what I have for you today. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of mine as a missionary with InFaith, the views and opinions expressed, believed, or lived out by myself or those appearing in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the position, beliefs, or opinions of InFaith as a mission.